The bunker stood half swallowed by earth and time, its concrete skin cracked and stained by years of moisture and neglect. What had once been a shield against artillery and fire now felt like a tomb carved into the bones of the land. Sergeant Richard Hale stepped cautiously inside, his boots echoing softly against the damp floor as his eyes adjusted to the dim, suffocating gloom. The air smelled of rust, old dust, and something faintly metallic like the residue of fear that never fully left. He swept his flashlight along the narrow interior, revealing overturned crates, a rotting wooden bench, scattered remnants of ration tins, and torn fabric clinging to the walls. This place had been abandoned in chaos, left behind when the front collapsed, yet it did not feel empty. It felt watched, preserved. As the beam of light drifted across the far wall, Richard noticed something unusual. Lines, scratches. At first they seemed random, like damage from shrapnel or tools, but as he stepped closer, his breath slowed. They were words, etched deeply into the concrete by trembling hands, each letter uneven, carved with desperation rather than precision. He wiped away grit and mold with his glove, revealing the message more clearly. If someone finds this, know that I did not leave. I stayed until the end. Richard stared at the words, his pulse tightening in his chest. Whoever had written this had not been passing time. He had been counting final moments. Below the first line, more words had been clawed into the wall. The strokes deeper, rougher, as if the writer's strength had been fading even as the need to be heard grew stronger. The walls shake. The ceiling falls. I can hear them above me. I will not scream. A cold stillness crept through Richard's spine as he traced the grooves lightly with his fingertip. The thought of a man alone in this suffocating darkness, surrounded by war, writing instead of begging, struck him with a quiet, unbearable weight. He imagined it now. Flickering lamplight, dust falling with every distant explosion, hands bleeding as they carved sentence after sentence into unforgiving stone, clinging to the only thing left, the certainty that someone someday might read these words. Outside, the world had moved on, fields had grown quiet, nations had rebuilt, but here, beneath layers of forgotten soil and silence, a soldier's final voice still waited. Richard lowered his light slightly, eyes following the final incomplete line etched at the bottom of the wall. The last words grew faint, as if the hand that wrote them had trembled, weakened, perhaps fallen. Tell my brother I... The sentence ended there. No name, no unit, no final goodbye. Only a fragment of a life suspended in concrete, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And as Richard stood alone in the bunker's cold shadow, he understood with chilling clarity. This was not just an abandoned structure. It was a confession, a farewell, a grave made of words. Richard remained motionless before the wall, the beam of his flashlight fixed upon the unfinished sentence as if it might somehow complete itself under his gaze. Dust drifted slowly through the stale air, settling on the floor like ash from a long-extinguished fire. Yet the weight of that final line made the bunker feel anything but dead. The soldier who had carved these words had not vanished into history. He lingered here, caught between concrete and memory. Richard stepped closer, examining the depth of the grooves. Some letters were sharp and deliberate, others shaky, uneven, as if the hand that formed them had staggered between determination and weakness. He could almost trace the timeline of fading strength in every imperfect line. tell my brother he whispered quietly, and the sound of his own voice echoed faintly off the narrow walls. Who had this man been? Where was his brother now? Did he live unaware that the last words meant for him remained trapped beneath layers of earth and silence? Richard swept the light further along the wall, noticing additional markings barely visible beneath streaks of moisture. Fainter words, scratched hurriedly, unevenly, as though written in moments of fear. The air grows thin. My hands are bleeding. I will stay awake. His jaw tightened. The man who wrote this had clung to consciousness not for comfort, but for defiance. To leave evidence. To ensure he was not erased without witness. Richard shifted his stance, feeling the cold seep through the soles of his boots. In that enclosed space, he imagined the soldier's final moments. The distant rumble of shells, concrete trembling, dust choking every breath, time stretching and collapsing under the weight of inevitability. And amid it all, a man refusing to let his voice die unheard. He turned away briefly, drawing a slow breath, yet found his eyes returning again and again to the final broken sentence. It pulled at him like an unresolved echo. "I'll find him," Richard murmured. "Your brother." The promise left his lips before he realized he had made it. He did not know how. He did not know where. But something within him refused to let this voice fade back into the silence that had swallowed it for so long. And as he lowered the beam of his light and continued deeper into the bunker, he felt the quiet certainty that this place still held more than shadows. It held the fragments of a story that was not yet finished. A story that had waited decades for someone willing to listen. Richard advanced deeper into the bunker, his flashlight carving narrow tunnels of light through the stagnant darkness. Every step echoed heavily, as if the ground itself remembered the weight of the men who had once stood here, waiting, fighting, suffocating. The walls closed in slightly as the corridor narrowed, and the air grew colder, thicker, tasting faintly of mold and old iron. He found another chamber, smaller than the first, its ceiling low and scarred by cracks that spidered outward like frozen lightning. Against one side lay the rusted remnants of a field bed, its metal frame twisted and bent under an ancient collapse. Nearby, a shattered helmet rested on the floor, half covered by dust and fragments of concrete. Richard crouched and lifted it slowly. Inside, dried leaves and grime filled the hollow where a head had once been protected. He imagined the unknown soldier removing this helmet to carve his final message, setting it aside with a care he no longer had strength to spare. He set the helmet back down and noticed something else beside it, a small personal tin dented and corroded. He pried it open gently. Inside lay a few brittle paper scraps, edges curled and faded as if exposed to damp for far too long. Carefully, he unfolded one. The handwriting was faint, almost ghost-like, but still legible. "Dear Martin, I don't know when this will reach you or if it ever will." Richard's heart tightened. Martin. The brother. He read on, lips moving silently as the words revealed themselves like a voice returning from somewhere beyond time. "If the walls fall, remember that I fought. Not because I hated those above me, but because I wanted to come home and see the river again." The sentence broke off there, the remainder lost to rot in years of silence. Yet it was enough. Enough to know this man had dreamed of something beyond this bunker, beyond war, beyond despair. Richard exhaled slowly, folding the fragile scrap back into the tin. "You made it," he murmured, though emotion tightened his voice. "Your words survived." In that dim chamber, the bunker no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like a final room where a man's last hopes had been held close, whispered into concrete instead of sky. Richard rose carefully and looked back toward the corridor where the carved message waited. The final unfinished sentence echoed in his thoughts once more. "Tell my brother I..." And now, through faded ink and bleeding stone, Richard finally understood. He was not merely reading history. He was listening to the last breath of a man who refused to vanish without being heard. Richard sat on the edge of the rusted field bed, the small tin resting in his hands as if it were something sacred. The name Martin echoed quietly in his thoughts, no longer just a word, but a living thread connecting the present to a forgotten life buried beneath concrete and time. Somewhere, perhaps far from this shattered ground, there might still be a man who had once waited for a brother who never returned. He rose slowly and returned to the first chamber, his light once again settling on the wall where the unfinished sentence still lingered. The groove seemed deeper now, more desperate, as though the message itself knew it had almost been lost forever. "Tell my brother I..." Richard whispered again, feeling the weight of that silence more sharply than any echo. He imagined the final moments more clearly now. The soldier, name unknown but soul painfully present, struggling for breath as dust filled his lungs, straining his hand to carve words that his weakening body could barely support. Not for glory, not for command, but for one person who mattered: his brother. Richard reached into his pack and removed a small field journal. With careful strokes, he copied the full message from the wall, every line, every broken phrase, preserving it in ink before time could erase what war had already tried to silence. He noted the name Martin, the reference to the river, the faint expressions of longing that had survived in fragments of thought. "I will find him," Richard said firmly to the empty chamber, though the promise felt less like duty and more like inevitability. "He deserves to know you did not simply disappear." The bunker seemed to respond with quiet stillness, as if it acknowledged the vow. Outside, faint daylight filtered through the cracked entrance, offering a pale reminder that the world above continued to breathe while this place held on to its final whisper. Richard turned one last time to look at the wall, committing every line to memory. "You did not leave. You stayed until the end. And now, through the persistence of your final words, you would finally be heard." Richard stepped out of the bunker just as the pale light of late afternoon spread across the land. The fresh air felt almost unreal after the suffocating stillness below, yet the weight of what he had read followed him like a quiet shadow. Behind him, buried beneath layers of concrete and silence, a soldier's final voice remained etched into stone, no longer forgotten, no longer alone. He turned back once, letting his eyes rest on the dark entrance that had held a man's last stand and last confession. Somewhere in that cold chamber, a hand had refused to surrender to silence, carving truth into a world that had already decided to move on. Richard opened his journal and read the words he had copied softly, as if reciting them might finally carry them to the one they were meant for. "Tell my brother I fought. I stayed. I remembered home." Though the original sentence had never been finished, its meaning was now clear. The soldier had not died in fear but in defiance of being erased. His last breath had not been a scream but a message. Richard knew his duty was no longer here beneath the earth. It lay beyond, somewhere in the world where a man named Martin might still live with unanswered questions and a silence that never made sense. He closed the journal carefully. "You will be found," he murmured, "and he will know you did not fade without a voice." The wind rolled across the abandoned land, carrying dust and echoes of a past that stubbornly refused to disappear. Yet in that haunting quiet, something had shifted. A story once trapped beneath concrete had risen again, carried now by the living. Richard walked away from the bunker with slow, deliberate steps, holding not just notes and promises, but the final words of a man who had clung to meaning until the very end. The bunker returned to silence, but its voice no longer belonged to the dark. It belonged to memory, to truth, to a brother who would finally hear the words that had waited decades to be spoken.